Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Cultural practices in discourse analysis. Cultural practices in discourse analysis refer to the ways in which language reflects, constructs, and perpetuates cultural norms, values, and beliefs. Discourse is not merely a tool for communication but is deeply embedded in the cultural practices of societies. Through discourse, cultural identities are constructed, maintained, and negotiated, shaping how people understand their roles, relationships, and place within the world. In discourse analysis, researchers explore how cultural practices are embedded in language use and how these practices reflect broader societal structures and ideologies. 1. The role of discourse in shaping cultural practices. Discourse plays a critical role in shaping and transmitting cultural practices by influencing how individuals and groups think, behave, and interact. Cultural practices refer to the everyday activities, rituals, and norms that are shared within a community. These practices are not fixed but evolve over time, influenced by social, historical, and political contexts. Discourse analysis allows researchers to examine how language reinforces or challenges these practices. Language as a carrier of culture. Language is often described as a carrier of culture because it encodes the values, norms, and worldviews of a particular community. Through discourse, cultural knowledge is passed down from generation to generation, helping to preserve traditions and societal norms. The way people talk about certain topics or engage in specific speech practices reveals much about their cultural identity. Example, in many cultures, the way people use language to show respect, such as honorifics, polite forms, or deferential speech, reflects deeply ingrained cultural values related to hierarchy, age, and social status. A discourse analysis of these speech patterns can reveal how such cultural practices are reinforced through everyday language. Discursive practices and socialization. Discursive practices refer to the ways in which language is used to perform and reproduce cultural behaviors and norms. Through discursive practices, individuals are socialized into their cultural communities, learning how to behave, speak, and interact according to cultural expectations. Discourse analysis examines how these practices are embedded in everyday interactions, such as greetings, rituals, and storytelling, and how they shape cultural identity. Example: in some indigenous cultures, storytelling serves as a discursive practice for passing down knowledge about history, morality, and community values. A discourse analyst might explore how these narratives reflect cultural worldviews and how they function as a means of cultural preservation. Point 2. Cultural norms and communication styles. Different cultures have distinct communication styles that reflect their values, social structures, and interactional norms. These communication styles can vary significantly across cultures, leading to differences in how people use language to express politeness, directness, emotionality, and formality. Discourse analysis helps identify and understand these variations, revealing how cultural norms shape language use. High context versus low context communication. One key distinction in cultural communication styles is between high context and low context cultures. In high context cultures, much of the communication relies on implicit understanding, shared knowledge, and nonverbal cues. In contrast, low context cultures tend to use more explicit, direct language, with less reliance on shared context. Discourse analysis examines how these communication styles manifest in language use and how they reflect broader cultural practices. Example: in a high-context culture like Japan, indirect language and nonverbal communication, such as silence or gestures, play an important role in conveying meaning. A discourse analysis might explore how speakers use indirect speech to avoid conflict or express politeness. In contrast, in a low-context culture like the United States, discourse often values directness and clarity, with speakers explicitly stating their intentions. Politeness and face in cultural discourse. Politeness strategies vary widely across cultures and are influenced by cultural understandings of face, the concept of self-image and respect. In some cultures, maintaining face is of paramount importance, and politeness is achieved through indirectness, humility, and deference. In others, politeness may be expressed through directness and honesty. Discourse analysts examine how different cultures use language to negotiate politeness and manage face in interactions. Example: in many East Asian cultures, such as Korea and China, politeness is expressed through indirectness and the avoidance of overt disagreement, reflecting cultural norms around harmony and respect for authority. A discourse analyst might explore how these norms influence conversational strategies in business or family settings. Point 3. Ritualized language in cultural practices. Ritualized language refers to specific forms of language use that are tied to cultural rituals, ceremonies, or significant events. These ritualized forms of discourse often follow strict patterns and conventions that reflect the values and beliefs of a community. Discourse analysis of ritualized language explores how these linguistic forms reinforce social order, transmit cultural values, and mark important social transitions. Language and religious rituals. Religious practices often involve highly formalized and ritualized language that reflects the sacredness of the occasion and the authority of religious traditions. This language can include prayers, chants, or specific formulas that are passed down through generations, preserving the cultural and religious identity of the community. Example: in Christian weddings, phrases like, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," or "till death do us part," are ritualized expressions that mark the transition from single to married life. Discourse analysis of wedding ceremonies would explore how these ritualized expressions reflect cultural and religious norms around marriage and family. Ceremonial discourse in cultural traditions. In many cultures, important life events, such as births, weddings, and funerals, are marked by ceremonial discourse that follows specific cultural scripts. These scripts often include formal language, traditional greetings, and expressions of respect or blessing, all of which reflect the cultural values attached to the event. Example: in a traditional Maasai wedding in Kenya, ceremonial discourse involves the exchange of blessings between families, using language that reflects the community's values around family, fertility, and social unity. Discourse analysis would examine how the language used in these ceremonies reinforces the cultural importance of kinship and continuity. Point 4. Cultural representation in media and political discourse. Media and political discourse are key sites where cultural practices and values are represented, negotiated, and contested. The way culture is portrayed in these discourses can shape public perceptions of identity, community, and belonging. Discourse analysis of media and political texts uncovers how cultural norms, stereotypes, and ideologies are reproduced or challenged in the public sphere. Media representation of cultural groups. The media often serves as a platform for representing different cultural groups, and the language used to describe these groups can either reinforce stereotypes or challenge them. Discourse analysis focuses on how media portrayals reflect or distort cultural practices and how these representations influence public attitudes toward different communities. Example: news coverage of indigenous communities may frame these groups as either traditional and primitive, or as marginalized and victimized, depending on the political and cultural context. Discourse analysis would investigate how such portrayals reflect broader societal attitudes toward indigenous culture and how they shape public understanding of these communities. National identity in political discourse. Political leaders frequently use discourse to construct and promote national identity, often drawing on cultural symbols, myths, and values. The language of nationalism can reflect and reinforce cultural practices by invoking shared history, traditions, and beliefs that bind the nation together. Discourse analysts examine how political speeches and rhetoric reflect cultural practices and how they mobilize national identity for political purposes. Example: in U.S. political discourse, references to the American dream invoke cultural values of individualism, hard work, and success. Discourse analysts might study how politicians use this concept to frame policy discussions and appeal to voters' cultural identity, examining how the rhetoric reinforces or challenges American cultural norms. Point 5. Globalization and cultural hybridization in discourse. The process of globalization has led to increased interaction between different cultures, resulting in the hybridization of cultural practices. Discourse analysis of globalization focuses on how language reflects the blending of cultural practices and how local and global discourses interact to create new cultural forms. Cultural hybridization in language use. Cultural hybridization occurs when elements from different cultures combine to create new practices, values, or identities. This can be seen in the adoption of foreign words, concepts, or practices into local discourses, leading to the creation of new cultural meanings. Discourse analysts study how these hybrid forms emerge and what they reveal about cultural exchange and adaptation. Example: in many African countries, local languages blend with English to create new forms of communication, such as Nigerian Pidgin English, which combines English with local languages and cultural expressions. Discourse analysis of Nigerian Pidgin would explore how this hybrid language reflects the blending of colonial and local cultural practices. Transnational discourse and global cultural practices. As global communication expands, transnational discourses emerge, reflecting the flow of cultural practices across borders. These discourses often highlight the tensions between local traditions and global influences, as communities negotiate how to adapt to or resist cultural change. Discourse analysts examine how language is used to mediate these processes of cultural transformation. Example: the global discourse around climate change has led to the adoption of environmental practices in local cultures worldwide. Discourse analysts might explore how global concepts like sustainability or carbon footprint are integrated into local cultural practices and how they reflect new forms of cultural identity around environmental activism. Point 6. Examples of cultural practices in discourse analysis. Example 1. Gendered language in professional settings. In many cultures, workplace discourse reflects gendered expectations and roles. A discourse analysis might examine how language in a corporate setting perpetuates gender norms, such as when male employees dominate meetings or when women are expected to use more polite and deferential language. This analysis would explore how cultural practices around gender are enacted and maintained in professional discourse. Example 2. Religious discourse and community rituals. In a religious community, ritual language plays a key role in shaping cultural practices and reinforcing group identity. Discourse analysts might study the language used during religious ceremonies, such as prayers or hymns, to understand how they reflect the community's cultural values around spirituality, morality, and social cohesion. Example 3. Nationalism in political rhetoric. In political speeches, national leaders often draw on cultural symbols and values to unite the public. Discourse analysis might examine how a politician uses cultural narratives of patriotism, sacrifice, or heritage to construct a national identity that reflects the country's historical and cultural practices. This analysis would reveal how political discourse mobilizes culture to achieve political goals. Conclusion: cultural practices in discourse analysis reveal the deep connections between language, culture, and society. By examining how language reflects and shapes cultural norms, values, and behaviors, discourse analysts uncover the ways in which cultural identity is constructed, maintained, and negotiated. Whether studying everyday conversations, ritualized language, or media representations, discourse analysis provides critical insights into how cultural practices are embedded in language use and how they evolve in response to social and global changes. Understanding these dynamics allows for a deeper appreciation of the role that discourse plays in the ongoing construction of cultural life. Frequently asked questions. What are cultural practices in discourse analysis? Cultural practices in discourse analysis refer to how language reflects, constructs, and perpetuates cultural norms, values, and beliefs. Discourse is seen as an essential component of cultural practices, as it shapes how people understand their roles, relationships, and place within society. Through discourse analysis, researchers explore how cultural identities are formed, maintained, and negotiated through language use. How does discourse shape cultural practices? Discourse shapes cultural practices by influencing how individuals and groups think, behave, and interact. Language encodes the values, norms, and worldviews of a culture, serving as a medium through which cultural knowledge is passed down and traditions are preserved. For example, the use of polite forms of address in certain cultures reflects hierarchical values and social status, reinforcing these practices through everyday language. What is meant by language as a carrier of culture? Language is a carrier of culture because it carries the values, norms, and worldviews of a community. It preserves cultural knowledge and transmits it across generations. The way people talk about certain topics and the specific linguistic forms they use reveal much about their cultural identity. For instance, honorifics and deferential speech in various cultures indicate respect for hierarchy and social status. What are discursive practices in cultural contexts? Discursive practices are the ways in which language is used to perform and reproduce cultural behaviors and norms. They involve patterns of communication that socializes individuals into their cultural communities. For example, storytelling in indigenous cultures serves as a discursive practice for passing down historical, moral, and communal knowledge, preserving cultural values through narrative. How do cultural norms affect communication styles? Cultural norms shape communication styles, influencing how people use language to express politeness, directness, emotionality, and formality. High-context cultures rely on implicit understanding and nonverbal cues, while low-context cultures use explicit, direct language. For example, in high-context cultures like Japan, indirect language is often used to avoid conflict, whereas in low-context cultures like the United States, directness and clarity are valued. What is the role of politeness and face in cultural discourse? Politeness and face refer to the management of self-image and respect in interactions. Different cultures have varying strategies for expressing politeness and maintaining face. In some cultures, indirectness and humility are valued to avoid offending others, while in others, directness may be seen as a sign of honesty. Discourse analysis examines how language is used to negotiate politeness and face across different cultural contexts. How does ritualized language function in cultural practices? Ritualized language is specific language used in cultural rituals, ceremonies, or significant events. It follows strict patterns and conventions that reflect cultural values and social order. For example, in religious ceremonies, formal language like prayers or blessings reinforces the sacredness of the occasion and transmits cultural and religious identity. Discourse analysis explores how these linguistic forms reinforce social norms and mark important transitions. How are cultural practices represented in media discourse? Media discourse plays a significant role in representing cultural practices, norms, and values. The language used in media can either reinforce stereotypes or challenge them, shaping public perceptions of different cultural groups. For example, news coverage of indigenous communities can either portray them in a way that reinforces stereotypes or highlight their cultural heritage positively. Discourse analysis investigates these portrayals and their impact on societal attitudes. How does political discourse use culture to construct national identity? Political discourse often uses language to construct and promote national identity by drawing on cultural symbols, myths, and values. Politicians may invoke shared history, traditions, and beliefs to create a sense of unity and belonging. For instance, in U.S. political discourse, references to the American dream reflect cultural values of individualism and success, shaping national identity and influencing policy discussions. What is cultural hybridization in discourse? Cultural hybridization refers to the blending of elements from different cultures to create new practices, values, or identities. This process is reflected in language use, such as the adoption of foreign words or concepts into local discourse. Discourse analysis studies how these hybrid forms emerge and reveal the dynamics of cultural exchange and adaptation. An example is Nigerian Pidgin English, which combines English with local languages and cultural expressions. How does globalization affect cultural practices in discourse? Globalization leads to the emergence of transnational discourses that reflect the interaction and blending of cultural practices across borders. Global communication introduces new cultural forms and concepts, creating tensions between local traditions and global influences. Discourse analysis examines how language mediates these processes, revealing how communities adapt to or resist cultural change. How do different cultures express politeness in discourse? Different cultures have unique ways of expressing politeness, often influenced by cultural values around hierarchy, respect, and social harmony. For example, in East Asian cultures, politeness is often expressed through indirect language and the avoidance of overt disagreement, reflecting values of harmony and respect for authority. In contrast, Western cultures may express politeness through directness and honesty, valuing individual expression. How does discourse analysis help in understanding cultural practices? Discourse analysis helps in understanding cultural practices by examining how language reflects and shapes cultural norms, values, and behaviors. It reveals the ways in which cultural identities are constructed, maintained, and negotiated through language use. By analyzing everyday conversations, ritualized language, media representations, and political rhetoric, discourse analysis provides insights into the dynamic interplay between language and culture.